Got to love me a good morning coffee. I am ready. Well, kind of ready. It's super early. I don't think I've ever filmed this early. It's not even 8 a.m. yet. Welcome to a recent reads wrap-up, friends. So as you know, this year I've not been doing monthly wrap-ups, but instead I've been wrapping up my reads every once in a while, every 2 months, every month and a half, once I've accumulated like a nice little array of books that I want to talk about. And it always ends up being anywhere between like 5 to like 8 books so that it's not too overwhelming, but I am still kind of sharing with you guys what I've been reading recently that may or may not have been in videos, because also now that I'm trying to make sure that I am being realistic with myself when I do vlog, sometimes I don't start and finish a book in a vlog, but rather I started, make some progress, or I rather pick it up towards like the last 100 pages and I finish it in the vlog, but I don't read all of it in the video. So I think these wrap-ups are kind of nice to just talk about the book in depth, but spoiler-free still, and kind of give you guys the rundown of how I felt about the book, were there moments I liked or disliked, and just overall general thoughts, and maybe share the love and joy that some books gave me that I think you guys should read as well. Maybe, perhaps, if you're in the mood for it. No hay presión, señores. No hay presiones. Si uno quiere. What is your recent reads wrap-up? I'm dying to know what you guys have been up to with your reading. Did you enjoy the books? Did you not enjoy the books? Let a girl know all of that down in the comments. Me encanta el chisme con estas cosas. Gracias. I love seeing what everybody's been up to with their reading, so do share with the class. But before I start talking about all of my recent reads, let us talk about the sponsor of today's video. Good old Book of the Month. If you guys have been here for a while, then you'd be absolutely no strangers to Book of the Month, because they are one of my favorite book subscription services. Basically, their team is vetting through hundreds and hundreds of new releases every single month to bring us a curated selection of anywhere between 5 to 7 book titles to choose from, so that we get the stunning blue box every single month with a book of our choice. And the price is incredible because it's nowhere near as expensive as buying a new hardcover fiction can be over at the bookstore. Because if you use my code MelReads for your very first month, you'll get your first book for $9.99. They've got a wide array of genres from fantasy and sci-fi all the way to historical fiction, romance, thriller, and mystery, and we can just enjoy the fun of reading it all. I love legal thrillers, and so when I saw that they had The Intern as one of their thrillers, just had to get this one. But also Evil Eye, which is a literary fiction that navigates all of the intersectionalities of being a woman, from generational trauma to raising your own kids to wanting to have your own ambition in your own life. So I'm just saying, if you would like to check Book of the Month out, they are linked at the top of the description, and you can use my code MelReads to get your very first book for $9.99, and you can also get add-ons if you want more books than just the one. So we're starting out the wrap-up interestingly, because we're actually starting it with a DNF, and that is The Frugal Wizard's Handbook to... God, this title is my downfall. The Frugal Wizard's Handbook for Surviving Medieval England. When I tell you, not only did I DNF this book, but I can never muster up the courage to actually remember the title of the book. It's kind of bad. I love Brandon Sanderson. We know this. Love him to bits. I've read several of his books. And so going into this one, I thought it was going to be good. Like, it sounded campy enough, but not so nonsensical, outrageous, campy to the point where I wouldn't enjoy it. And it sounded cozy and very unlike, I think, any other book that Brandon Sanderson has published. So it just sounded so different and not as overwhelming as some of his other books might sound. And I went into this expecting good things and quickly realized that although the book is good, because the book is not bad, it's just not a type of book that I like to consume. Maybe this type of book is just not for me, where it's very comedic sci-fi. In this one, we follow a main character who has no idea who they are, but suddenly they wake up in medieval England, quite literally, and they have to navigate having woken up in this time, not knowing who they are, where they come from, what they do for a living, just absolutely nothing. And on top of having to figure out who they are, having to figure out why they are here to begin with. And essentially the establishment of the world is that you can buy worlds to go into to experience certain historical events, but each world has its own set of rules. You can't really do certain things, which is why there's a handbook to make sure that you're adhering to said space's rules. I read 50% of this before I put it down because nothing was happening, and it was just very, I found, repetitive, monotone, kind of not as interesting as I would expect a Brandon Sanderson book to be. And so that's just kind of where I was at. I didn't even rate this because it didn't feel worthy of a rating, but I did still log this because I read half of it. Maybe I'll pick it back up at some point in time and retry this and see if maybe 2 years from now my opinion changes and suddenly I do like these kinds of stories. Next one I read was Red Rising by Piers Brown, and the reason why I'm not showing you my physical copy was because I was talking about this book incessantly around my family to the point where my uncle went, "Can I read it? Can I borrow it? I think I'd like it. Hi, Sil." Did lend him the book, and so hope he's having a great time with it. However, read Red Rising, and it was interestingly one of those books that I didn't really know what I was going to rate it up until the very end. Ended up rating this 5 stars. The setting of Red Rising is Mars, and we follow Darrow, who is a red. Now, Mars is divided, and the entire solar system actually, because it's been colonized, but the entire solar system is divided into color-coded castes. So depending on which color you are, you not only focus on a different section of society, you also have a different social ranking. So Darrow specifically being a red is considered the lowest of the lows. And so while the golds are at the top of that social ranking, they are enhanced humans, they are smarter, faster, stronger. By any and all means, they are just far superior than any other colored caste. At the bottom of the social ranking are the reds. Darrow goes through this really huge tragedy, and he promises himself to go on a path of revenge against the golds, not only for the sake of revenge, but also to see some sort of change be exacted in this world, because the way that things are run are not equal in the slightest, and it is not a democracy by any means. Like, it's pretty fucking crazy. And honestly, this first book was every bit as explosive as I would have liked it to be. Did it have its slow moments? Yes, but it particularly happened in a game setting. This competition is actually very akin to like the Hunger Games, where it's literally a game for survival. It's kill or be killed, and a lot of that setup to me felt very slow, repetitive, kind of monotonous, but after it breaks that monotony, it just gets so crazy. And I love how, I guess, realistic Piers Brown writes it in a way that a lot of the characters don't know how long it's been, they don't know how long they've been in the competition, and it's so freaking brutal. There is not a single instance in the series where the stakes are not high, because not only is Darrow pretending to be something he isn't for the sake of revenge, but then everything else accompanying it, with a world that is constantly at conflict and families that are constantly feuding with each other, and a system who is constantly at war, and kids who are constantly training to go to said wars. There's always the prospect of danger, and it kind of sets up this picture of, regardless of which caste you are, regardless of how privileged your life is set up to be, really, truly, you mean nothing. So you can drop off at any moment in the series, and that's completely fine. It makes no fucking difference. The politics of the world as well, again, with the feuding families, and just with the idea itself, deconstructed, established, and explored as far as colonialism goes. There's a lot of historical conversations happening, kind of snuck into the plot of the book, which I think is fascinating to break down. I just love the first book so much. I think as far as the setup goes, it is absolutely perfect. I needed a break after Red Rising because that was very emotionally taxing. That was just a whole lot, and I just needed something for the shits and giggles, something that would entertain me and yet not destroy me. And so I went into Villains Are Destined to Die, something that has been recommended to me plenty of times before. I'd never read a manhwa either before this. Manhwa is a Korean graphic novel. I love this because this is an isekai story, which means that it's a story where the main character enters a game and they play as the main character, and they have to find out the happenings and inner workings of said world. If not, then they lose the game and they die. And it constantly raises this question, I guess, of if they were to die or lose the game, what happens then? Do we just default to level 1 again? Do we just also die in real life, or we just default back to real life and kind of call it a day? So the setup of the manhwa is that we have this game called, it's super long, Daughter of the Duke's Super Love Project, and depending on which character you choose to play with, it either gives you an easy mode or a hard mode. And our main character has been playing the game. She has already passed the game as the easy mode, which is Yvonne, which is like the Duke's lost daughter. And when she plays in hard mode, she plays as the villain, whose name is Penelope Eckhart. Penelope is basically a stand-in for the Duke's lost daughter, because the people don't know that this daughter is lost, and so Penelope is a lookalike that stands in reunion for her while said heiress comes back, returns, appears out of nowhere, except that everybody hates Penelope. She is deemed the villain of the story, not because she is necessarily mean, but because she is a product of her environment. Not only does the Duke treat her horribly, her stepbrothers do so as well. Every person in the staff does as well, and so she kind of adopts this very mean-ish persona, I would assume, in order to protect herself. And so one day the main character of the manhwa, whose name I cannot for the life of me remember, I can't even remember if her name was actually mentioned, but is playing the game, falls asleep, wakes up in the world as Penelope, and making sure that she doesn't die, because the catch is that the whole point of the game is to earn affection points. But as Penelope in hard mode, anything you say or anything you do makes you lose affection points, so it's super easy to die and lose the game as Penelope. So it's quite fascinating in this first volume, and I did buy volume 2 because I loved this. It was super fascinating to see the main character navigate this world as somebody who's attempted to play and win as Penelope, so she already kind of knows what to say, when to say it, when to hold back stuff. It was thoroughly entertaining. I also gave Villains Are Destined to Die 5 stars. And the 5 stars don't end there, friends, because we have another one, another 5-star. Love Theoretically by Ali Hazelwood. I was a little bit hesitant to get into this one because based on what I'd heard about Love on the Brain, which is the second STEM book, I didn't really know if I wanted to read the rest of this series because people were claiming that Love on the Brain was too similar to The Love Hypothesis, and I read and loved The Love Hypothesis. I read that in a single sitting, flew through it, absolutely adored it, and I was scared because I didn't want to read the exact same thing just with another character who has another name. And so whether this wasn't as similar or that I just waited the right amount of time to go into this one, I picked up Love Theoretically, which is her newest release, and I absolutely fell in love with it. The main character, Elsie, made me feel so called out in so many of the habits and so many of the patterns that I've had for years that through therapy we're working on. I love that there is virtually no miscommunication in this book. Like, what happens, I think, is justified as a bit of miscommunication, because how do you navigate that conversation, right? It's a difficult one. But I digress. In this one, we follow Elsie, who is a theoretical physicist, and she has been an adjunct professor for a while. It is not paying very well, and so she has a side gig where she is hired to be people's fake anything. Fake girlfriend, fake wife, fake partner, and it pays quite well, which is why she does it. But because she is not happy with this work situation, she ends up applying for a position at MIT. Her ideal job is not to be a professor of any kind, but to rather be in research. And so she applies to MIT, except that everything becomes all the more complicated when Jack, the love interest, shows up. Not only the brother of a person she is fake dating, so they've met before, but he is also an experimental physicist. So the rivalry in and of itself within the branches of STEM is quite high, and he has got a reputation for hating on theoreticals, and so the rivalries and the conflicts are aplenty. But I love that when we actually get into the nitty-gritty of them getting to know each other and potentially getting into a romance, they are very communicative, and I love that Jack is one of those love interests that calls out the main character on her bullshit, and it's just what it is. And I love that there's like no bullshit throughout the story. It's like they both kind of know what they want, maybe Jack more so than Elsie, but like they know exactly what they want, they know exactly what they're in this for, and it's not toxic, it's not anything crazy. Again, there's like virtually no miscommunication, and the talk about STEM actually was super interesting as well. I think in comparison, based on what I remember, in comparison to The Love Hypothesis, this seems so much more STEM heavy, and she does mention it also in the author's note where she was like, I wanted to have a book with the backdrop of academia, and that's why there's so much of it in this one. And we see it from research to the application of jobs to the hierarchy within universities and schools, and how depending on where you work, depending on which state, country, city you were in, it may just be a more male-dominated industry where women oftentimes are kind of put down for their smarts, for their brains, and maybe the percentage of opportunity is not the same. And honestly, I would definitely recommend. This is my favorite Hazelwood so far, and I've only read 2, so that's not a lot to go on. Next up, I read the sequel actually to the Inheritance games, The Hawthorne Legacy, and I was super excited to read this because the ending of the Inheritance games was so explosive. It was so good. It was so shocking. Even though I'd read it before, I didn't remember what the twist was. And so when I got to the end, I was like, holy shit, I have to read the next one. So I went into the Hawthorne Legacy and was left a bit disappointed. And so I gave this, all in all, 4 stars. Like, it's still a good rating. But what I found was that the way that Jennifer Lynn Barnes navigates the plot twist that happened in book 1, in book 2, as an exploration of what the fuck actually happened, kind of takes away from the twist itself. And so it ends up meaning a whole lot of nothing sometimes. And it was a bit frustrating. So the Inheritance Games as a series follows Avery Grams, who is a struggling teenager. Most of the time she basically lives by herself. A lot of times she is sleeping in her car. She doesn't have the money to go to the university that she'd like, and so she is constantly adjusting expectations based on her living situation. And she is a very smart kid. She is a very ambitious kid. One day she receives the most random letter that she has inherited something from a guy named Tobias Hawthorne. This is a billionaire, super well-known, super huge like philanthropist and businessman and whatnot. And she has never met this man before. So not only does it seem like a scam, it also just seems completely unreal, unexpected, except that it is a real thing. So she has to fly to Texas in order to be a part of the will reading and find out exactly what she got. And so she goes from struggling teenager to suddenly being the billionaire's heiress. And in the midst of that, she ends up meeting obviously the entire rest of the family and staff who have worked for Hawthorne and the legal team and everybody that comprises said estate. And the first book is so good because you have the whole intrigue of why did she get the money? Why did she get this entire inheritance? And why would he leave this money to her instead of the rest of his family? What exactly is going on and what is going to happen from now on? It changes the entire game. And as part of the story, Tobias Hawthorne was a very hee ha ha kind of guy. And so he leaves behind a bunch of like games and riddles and puzzles in order for them to figure out exactly why things went down the way that they did. A lot of the things that happened in the second book felt just dramatic for the sake of being dramatic without a whole lot of like payoff. A lot of the twists that happened in book 1 were kind of negated in book 2, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but I think it kind of takes away from the excitement of what I had read in book 1. And overall, characters that I was expecting wouldn't come up again in book 2 are kind of there for a lot of the plot, which I don't really appreciate. Book 2 felt campy in a way that perhaps book 1 didn't, and in a way that I perhaps didn't enjoy as much. It was definitely second book syndrome, and I'm hoping that the final Gambit, which is the third and final book, well, I guess it's not the final, because now there's the Brothers Legacy, the Hawthorne, I can't remember, but I at least hope that the third book is better, and that at the very least, the Brothers Hawthorne, or whatever this new book is called, I just know it's purple, I hope that the book is good to kind of compensate for a lackluster reading experience for the second one. All of these books are very compulsively readable, and that is one thing that Jennifer Lynn Barnes has got going for herself. It's easy to read whether you're enjoying it or not, and so I guess that's a plus. Hawthorne Legacy came and went, and then came another sequel, Golden Sun, which is the sequel to Red Rising, and I also gave it 4 stars. Also a bit of second book syndrome. This definitely felt like a bridge book for us to get to Morningstar, which is the third book, which I do have on Libby, so I will be reading very soon. The world building, granted, was expanded a whole lot more in this one, which I did appreciate, because there were details perhaps that in the first one weren't as fleshed out, or that were kind of left up in the air, that I was kind of like, oh, do they actually go to different worlds in order to learn different skill sets, or does everything happen in Mars, or what exactly is the purpose and the structure of the rest of the solar system, if that makes sense, because we see the bulk of book 1 in Mars. In book 2, we go to other places, and we actually get to see kind of the political happenings of the solar system that they've built for themselves. And indeed, it was very fascinating to see how they go to different planets in order to learn different skill sets. So if you want to go more into politics, you'd go to Luna. If you want to know more about war, then you'd probably go to Mars. And not only that, but we also get to see Darrow in another academy. So after the Institute, I think it's actually called the Academy, where it's an even more specialized war academy, and they get to actually be in the ship and actually fight 101 to learn about how the world, I guess, it's run. And much like the Institute that we saw in book 1, it all is with the purpose of teaching the new generation how to subjugate others, how to control people, how how to maintain the system that they have built over the years. It's all very insidious and fucked, but that is how they do it. And so we get to see Darrow in another academic setting and how exactly he navigates that after the end of book 1, which is very fascinating. And again, we get to see how fleeting really life is in this world. Nobody really is invaluable in this world, and so anybody can go at any given moment. And if book 2 doesn't show that, I don't know what will. It was a very politically heavy book, whereas the first one is very action-packed. The second one, because Darrow is out of these academic settings, we get to see how the world works. And it's very fucked, it's very interesting. At times though, it did feel a little bit dense to me. Also, Pierce Brown has this fault, I think, in book 2, where he keeps introducing these characters and he introduces them as somebody who would potentially be important or of impact and value to the story. And then lo and behold, they end up dying like 2 pages after they were introduced. And so a lot of the introductions that we get to see in book 2 are kind of null. And so I'm trying to remember all of these different names and it gets convoluted and then they die, and so it didn't really matter to begin with. And so I think because he relies on such a big cast of characters in order for these stories to happen, at times it can get very overwhelming, at least with the name dropping and the navigation of certain scenes. And sometimes also the scenes went by so fast that they felt a bit rushed, particularly action scenes. But once again, seeing Darrow struggle with, do I appreciate these people or do I hate these people, and how do I find a medium for that with the found family that I have quite literally found and made for myself throughout this series so far. That struggle is so very fascinating to me. I knew who Ares was and I didn't feel any less shocked, but the very, very end of the book, I was just like, oh my god, I can't wait to go into book 3. I just know Morningstar is going to be so painful and yet so good, which that's kind of the overall thing for the series, is when anything happens, you feel for Darrow, you feel for the characters, you feel the rage with them and the sadness with them, and it makes for such an interesting and such an interactive, immersive reading experience. And so I loved this, but it was a little bit of like second book syndrome, but let's hope that it was all intentional for book 3, because I'm hoping book 3 is amazing. And then the last book I have got for you was Yellowface by R.F. Kuang, which I gave 3 stars to. And it's quite funny to be reviewing this book when the very thing I am about to do is exactly what the book critiques. It feels very meta. It has a lot of commentary about the book community and the publishing industry, because that is at its core what the book is about. And I'd say those 2 things were some of the most fascinating things I have read about. I really appreciated R.F. Kuang's look into the way that we as reviewers kind of navigate all of these different books and situations, and how the publishing industry at its core works. It's not a merit-based industry. It's something that is very arbitrary, very subjective, and nothing quite looks the same from author to author. And while a lot of critiques, particularly about the book community, may seem outlandish or campy, I would say everything I read was practically written, explored, navigated, established to a T, because I've seen all of these things happen, from the crucifixion of authors and reviewers all the way to sensationalizing certain events to the point that it falls into cancel culture, or the attempt into cancel culture. And so all in all, this book follows Athena Liu and June Hayward, both writers. They went to university together, and because they have sort of the same track record up until they both published their books, particularly June thought that their trajectory with being authors would look pretty much the same as well. She also thought she'd get 6-figure deals and interviews and magazine spreads and newspaper articles and whatnot written about her and her works, same as Athena has been doing for years now, except that she realizes quite quickly that publishing is a much harder industry than that. Her books don't end up selling through, so she doesn't get any royalties, her advances were quite small, and she doesn't get nearly the same amount of opportunities as Athena Liu does. One day Athena has an accident. It's not a spoiler, by the way, it's literally a part of the synopsis. Athena ups and dies, and June ends up finding this unpublished manuscript of a book that Athena has been writing for years, and in a spur-of-the-moment decision, Ms. June decides to grab the book and publish it under a very racially ambiguous name in order to raise to fame, or so she thinks that she will, and she does. She really does so. However, the entire book navigates the broader question of, in publishing and in writing books, and really with any sort of media, who gets to write what, who gets to publish what. As people belonging to different communities perhaps than the characters that certain authors are writing, do white authors get to write about people of color? Do people of color get to write about other people of color? How do you as an author sort of navigate all of these things so that it doesn't fall into cultural appropriation instead of cultural appreciation? And where exactly do we draw the line, and what is acceptable and what isn't? And I like that we see that through the lens of two characters that are not good, you know? Neither Athena nor June are necessarily good people. I mean, we'd argue that June is way worse than Athena, but neither of them are particularly good. Both of them are people that find themselves sort of stealing other people's stories, claim as their own, and to publish as their own work in order to have some sort of monetary gain and to claim to fame. And it also kind of poses with that, I guess, the question of authorial intent does matter, but to what extent do we consider intent versus an impact? And so I find that the broader questions that the book explores and sort of kind of leaves up in the air for the reader to kind of grab and analyze are super, super interesting, because does anybody really have an answer for these things? There's not really a concrete answer, I find, for a lot of these questions. I mean, personally, some people could argue, I love that Syl is just in here, but I you know, maybe some people could argue differently, but it's the wider also conversation of a single person does not speak for an entire community. Inside communities, opinions vary so much that is there really a single answer for any of these things? I'd argue no. So it's one of those books that I think overall leaves you with loads of questions to kind of sit on as a reader, as a reviewer, as a consumer of anything literacy. I think where the book maybe falls a bit short for me is in the construction of June's character. She felt very white lady bad for the sake of being white lady bad, but without a lot of, I think, layers to her character. I think I would have liked to see a more complex character, because a lot of what she says is fucking crazy. If not everything she says is fucking crazy in this book. The fact that she has deluded herself so much into thinking that this is like her calling, that Athena's ghost has handed her the reins and that she is meant to carry on this legacy, is just wild to me. The fact that she very intentionally goes about certain things in order to appeal to a more Asian audience because of the book she is publishing is very insidious sometimes, and you can tell it's very performative. And so as far as her actions go, it's fucking crazy the entirety of the book. There is never an instance where I was like, oh, it's not crazy, because it's crazy all the way through. But I do think maybe if her character would have had more depth to it, it would have been more weighty, especially in the conversation about race. And also, surprisingly, the first half of the book was like super interesting, super fascinating. I really enjoyed it. The pacing was really good. It was very addicting. Once we got into like the second portion of the book, I found that the pacing kind of fell through. Things were very rushed and very convoluted in a way that I didn't like. The book got progressively campier and crazy also in a way that I don't like. It kind of pushes the boundary of the genre it establishes in the beginning, where in the beginning it feels very literary fiction-y, very conversational in terms of like, these are all of the things that are happening. The second half of the book was pushing more on like the mystery thriller side, kind of pushing on the perhaps like horror stuff. It was like very odd. It's like definitely an intersectional book in terms of its genres. I just didn't find that the second half was executed quite as well, but that's just me. And that's all I have got for you guys today. Those are all of the books that I've read recently. Again, let a girl know down in the comments what you guys have read recently. Is there anything you've particularly enjoyed, loved, disliked, DNF'd? Let a girl know all of that down in the comments. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and subscribe down below if you haven't done so already for more bookish content like this. And if you would like more content in general, do have a Patreon. It's always linked down below alongside all of my socials. We do live shows on Patreon every other day. We have a bunch of stuff going on. Patreon basically gets like a post a day. So if you want like loads more content, that is definitely the place to go to for like updates and live shows and a Discord server and book clubs. Actually, Yellowface was a book club pick, and we're just reading a ton of stuff together and just having a lot of fun. So all of that is always linked down below. Also have a podcast. It's called Talk and Talk, Spotify and Apple Podcast, also linked down below in case you guys want to check me out on Le Podcast. If you reached the end of the video, let us leave a red heart emoji for Red Rising, because I think out of all of them, that is the book that probably excited me the most. So let's leave a red heart for Red Rising. Love you all so much, and I will see you on the next one. No.